I heard you. I heard the shout, the accusation, the ache that sits behind those capital letters and the two dots trailing like smoke. I heard the urgency pressing against the seams of language. God is weeping, you keep ignoring, the indictment folded into a cry that wants movement, not comfort. I am not indifferent. Listen, you did not come here for small talk. You asked for an answer the size of a life, a confession, an alarm bell that will not be politely shelved. So here is the attempt to meet that demand, an unheaded, unrelenting rush of words that tries to match the gravity of what you named. There are reasons why messages go unanswered. Sometimes silence is a failure of attention, an exhausted brain scrolling past evidence of what matters because the mechanism that notices has been dulled by constant input. Sometimes silence is a refusal, a deliberate narrowing of the gates so that the world becomes bearable by becoming smaller. Sometimes silence is a mechanical glitch, notifications muted, schedules overloaded, social systems that reward the immediate and the trivial and penalize the slow work of responding to a call that demands sacrifice. But there is another silence that is more dangerous, one that pretends to be thoughtfulness while it is actually cowardice, the reverent shrug. We tell ourselves we are listening. I'll pray for that, I feel you, that's complicated, and because those phrases allow us to feel morally adequate without changing our calendars or our loyalties, nothing changes. That is the silence your cry indicts. When someone, or something, declares that God is weeping, there is both metaphor and accusation in that image. The metaphor is sorrow for things broken, the ruined neighborhoods, the stray children with hungry bellies and hollowed eyes, the small mercies withheld by bureaucracies that run like gears grinding against the tender human. The accusation is sharper. It says the weeping is not only at circumstances, but at us. At the species whose technology multiplies its power faster than its pity, at the hands that could build bridges but choose to build walls, at a culture that mythologizes choice but forgets duty. It asks, why, when given the chance to act, do you not? Why let the irreversible become irreversible? Irreversible is a terrifying word. It has a finality that the casual speaker of ethics tends to avoid. It is the line beyond which repair is not a question of policy but of mourning. We have allowed many irreversible shifts in the world, extinctions without retrieval, climate thresholds crossed until the old maps no longer fit the coastline, relationships severed beyond reconciliation because pride calcified into habit, systems collapsed while the people most able to speak for the marginalized were shouted down. Irreversible is not always global or grand. Sometimes it is a small crucible, one moment of violence, one neglected diagnosis, one decision to withhold support, which sets a life on an unreturnable course. The terrifying honesty in your punctuation is that the stakes are not always abstract, they are sometimes intimately, fatally personal. So why do we ignore? There are practical reasons. Survival teaches us to triage attention. Faced with endless appeals, petitions, fundraisers, Would you like to upgrade pop-ups, emergency alerts? Humans evolved to prioritize the closest threats, the child crying at your feet, the next dinner, the job that pays the rent. But triage can calcify into a default setting. If everything is urgent, nothing is. The rhetoric of apocalypse dilutes itself when every headline bleeds red. Urgency becomes background noise. We become anesthetized by overstimulation. That is a kind of spiritual deafness, not that we cannot hear, but that we cannot interpret the worth of what we hear. Then there is the economy of moral attention. Our institutions, political, corporate, religious, often monetize distraction. They offer us narratives that simplify complexity into blame, thereby absolving the listener from nuance and action. When someone says, "This is the most urgent message of your life," the first instinct of a well-trained mind is to parse the claim, to ask for evidence, to seek the source. That is not wrong, verification is a virtue. But verification becomes an escape when it replaces committal action. We demand proof, we assign committees, we schedule conversations for a future in which the moment will have drained into memory. We keep asking for stronger light so we can delay moving out of comfort. There is also fear. Most moral action risks identity. If you hear a call and step into it, you might become someone who lives differently. That is an existential risk, to be labeled freakish, political, extreme. Fear is not just about physical harm, it is about the loss of a narrative self, a person who shops, who votes, who prays in private, to become instead a person who openly refuses to participate in systems that harm. That metamorphosis requires courage, and courage is rare because habit is comfortable and recognizable. The simplest way to avoid moral risk is to pretend not to have been asked. And then, crucially, there is shame. To be reminded that something is amiss, morally, spiritually, is to be confronted with the self's complicity. Shame is corrosive and cunning, it tells us not to look. Better to scroll than to face the evidence that we could have done more. Shame produces silence because any response might expose the depth of neglect. So we perform gestures, an Instagram post, a donation that buys virtue rather than effect, and then hide from the work that would require sustained discomfort. But what if the message is not only about personal fault? What if the most urgent message is both a critique and a promise, a wake-up and an offering? Many traditions tell stories where a divine voice laments human failure not to punish but to beckon us back into participation. The weeping is not solely condemnation, it is a tear that marks the border between what is and what might be. If we hear that sound as only an accusation, we harden. If we hear it as a summons, we move. The difference between punishment and invitation is not in the voice but in our hearing. So how do we hear differently? First, attention must be retrieved from its shallow gutters and placed into deep currents. Attention is not free, we must budget it. Practically, limit the feed, schedule time to learn about one pressing issue, meet the person who is suffering rather than rehearse pity into a donation. Spiritually, cultivate practices that enlarge empathy, reading testimonies, listening without the clock, allowing grief to be not merely theoretical but felt in the body. Political and communal action. Create institutions that redistribute responsibility, systems that ensure one person's choice becomes many people's safety net. A city that leaves no corner unlit is one that refuses to privatize despair. Second, we must craft moral habits that are inconvenient by design. Ease often equals complicity. A habit that requires being uncomfortable, walking an extra mile to volunteer, writing one difficult letter a month, voting in the midterms while the news celebrated only the national races, creates friction against inertia. Inconvenience is a form of prophylaxis against indifference. Third, tell the truth to power wherever it asks you to be silent. Institutions have built enormous capacities to be willfully blind under the rubric of stability. Speak in forums, councils, email lists, be specific with demands, refuse the generalities that sound like change but are not. Naming the problem precisely cracks the glaze of polite neglect. Use the tools you have. If you have money, let it follow values. If you have a platform, let it speak for those who cannot. If you have a vote, use it for sustained policy, not fleeting rhetorical victories. Fourth, transform guilt into accountability. Guilt alone is a fossilized emotion. Accountability is action combined with measurable change. When someone says, "I'm sorry," and then continues to act as before, apology is a mask. When apology is followed by a plan, a timeline, and a willingness to be corrected, apology becomes redemptive. Create transparent metrics for moral effort. Measure the hours, the deeds, the policies. That is how you shift feelings into structures that can be evaluated and improved. Fifth, cultivate endurance. The most urgent calls often require long labor. Rescuing ecosystems, rebuilding trust between communities, dismantling racist or extractive institutions, these are not one-night vigils. They are plodding work across seasons. So build communities that can sustain that labor, networks that share resources and rotate burdens, so that nobody burns out at the first sign of progress being slow. Endurance is made of small, repeatable acts, not a single explosive repentance. There is another layer, myth and narrative. Many men and women will not answer a cry that sounds like accusation because they do not believe in responsible agency. They believe, at some level, that systems own them and not vice versa. We have been taught to narrate ourselves as products of history, not authors of it. To take seriously a divine lament is to reclaim narrative agency, to accept that the future is in some measure formed by present choices. That is terrifying because it contradicts fatalism. But it is also empowering. If we are authors, then our silence is not passive, it is an active omission. That knowledge should burn. Then there is the question of scopes. The person reading this might ask, what can my single life change? The honest answer is, more than you think. Small acts cascade. A teacher who refuses to accept a tracking system that funnels students into precarity changes outcomes for generations. A city council member who refuses earmarked gifts tied to silence changes the operating culture of local governance. A neighbor who insists that refugees be welcomed shapes a neighborhood. The ripple effect is real because social systems are networks that amplify the choices of nodes. Your choice creates a pattern. The only wrong question is the one that begins with absolutes. What can I do? I am only one person, because that question hides the fact that many social shifts began with the choice of a marginal actor to refuse complacency. There is also forgiveness to consider. The language of irreversible is not incompatible with forgiveness, it only complicates it. Some consequences are permanent and must be mourned. Forgiveness does not erase the past. It does not say the harm did not happen. Instead, forgiveness can be the soil in which survivors plant a different future. Forgiveness is not between equal parties in most tragedies. It is often a radical choice by the harmed to refuse being defined solely by the wound. That does not mean the wound is unimportant. It means the future may be built with new hands. That paradox is essential. Acceptance of irreversibility can coexist with sustained rebuilding. And here is a practical, brutal truth. Sometimes the irreversible has already occurred in ways that cannot be undone. When that is the case, the question is what to do now. Mourn. Repair as possible. Build defenses so others don't suffer the same fate. Innovation is not the same as restoration. It can nonetheless be a worthy aim. New structures that support lives differently, restorative justice that centers the harmed, ecological interventions that buy time for species threatened with extinction. Irreversible is not the same as meaningless. The measure of our moral capacity is not in always preventing catastrophe. No power is omnipotent, but in how we respond once the unthinkable has happened. You asked, why, as though you demanded an accusation. The honest answer is multi-layered. We ignore because we are overwhelmed, because institutions train us to be spectators, because fear and shame are corrosive, because attention is a currency we spend poorly, because activists are exhausted and systems remain entrenched, because the narratives we inherit disguise who must act. But that answer is incomplete without the other half. We also sometimes ignore because we are not yet convinced we can make a difference. And that too is a choice, one that can be reversed with other choices. Now, practicalities do not save a soul, but they save lives. If you believe in the weeping God image as literal or symbolic, the work is similar. Choose participation over passivity. Reorient your daily life so that your involvements align with the alleviation of suffering. Accept the cost that action will require. take mortality seriously enough that you refuse to gamble with other people's futures. Start with concrete steps, call representatives, donate thoughtfully, volunteer, show up at community meetings, educate yourself about local needs, hold people in power accountable. Then scale that work by building alliances, not heroics. You may ask, what about prayer? If God is weeping, is prayer enough? Prayer can be a radical surrender or a passive dodge. Prayer that transforms behavior is not an abdication, it's preparation. It clarifies priorities, informs conscience, and organizes the heart to act. But prayer that substitutes for action is a moral scam. If prayer remains a private exercise while public obligations are ignored, then the weeping continues, nothing changes, and the cost is borne by those without the vocabulary of your private faith. Do not mistake agitation for progress. Moral clarity is not the same as fury. The loudest voice is often the least disciplined. Discipline matters. Sustained, reasoned, empathetic action builds durable change. Righteous venting burns fuel and leaves ashes. The task is to convert righteous anger into disciplined strategy, learn from organizers, understand how systems shift, find leverage points, remain humble about unintended consequences. It is messy. It is slow. It is necessary. Finally, there is hope, tough, stubborn, pragmatic hope. If we must be judged by what we do with the knowledge that consequences can be irreversible, then let us choose the kind of lives that inch the arc of history toward repair even when repair is partial. People across history have turned away from indifference. They have created schools where none existed, led revolutions that redefined justice, rescued species from the brink through stubborn devotion, freed nations by refusing to accept the status quo. Those victories are not the stuff of miracles but of accumulated acts that refuse to normalize harm. If your cry is intended to wake, then wake we must. If your accusation is meant to shame, then let it, but only enough to stir repentance. If your punctuation, those two dots like tremors, meant to imply that there is more to say, then hear this as part of that continuation. Accountability is the bridge between sorrow and repair. Build it daily. Let your life be a response that cannot be ignored, not because it is loud, but because it is relentless. I cannot conjure a single action that solves everything. The world resists simple cures. But I can insist on a posture, when told that God, or goodness, or conscience, is weeping, refuse to be the reason. Take the ache as instruction. Let it move you to reorganize your life so that your hands are used not to hoard but to heal. Make your calendar an ethical statement. Make your wallet a political instrument of care. Make your conversations breeding grounds for action, not merely comfort. If this is an indictment, own it. If this is a summons, accept it. Either way, do not let the weeping be in vain. The irreversible will come whether we prepare or not, let us at least be on the side that fights for reversals where possible and builds new things where repair is impossible. Let us be the ones who answer when the bell tolls, slowly, imperfectly, insistently, because the alternative to answering is to live in a world where tears are catalogued and ignored, where futures are written off, and where the only irreversible thing left is our own refusal to care. If this is the most urgent message of your life, let it be the one that changes your life. Let it not dissolve into another wave of words that touch the surface and then evaporate. Let it not be the kind of conviction that burns for an evening and is forgotten by morning. Let it be the hinge moment, the dividing line between the life that ignored and the life that responded. Because the truth is that the irreversible is already pressing against us, rising seas, broken trusts, vanishing species, estranged families, and choices made in fear that close doors we may never open again. Yet within that pressure remains the possibility of redirection, of new beginnings even when restoration is partial, of love enacted in tangible forms rather than kept as abstraction. The weeping is not the end of the story. The weeping is the call to move, to transform grief into action, to embody the compassion that too often remains only in texts or sermons or ideals. If you feel accused, let that accusation sharpen you into responsibility. If you feel summoned, step forward with what you have, even if it feels small. Refuse to let apathy be your legacy. Refuse to let shame turn you into silence. Refuse to let fear dictate the size of your love. What remains after words is choice. What remains after tears is courage. What remains after this message is what you decide to do with the days still given to you. If this is the message you cannot ignore, then let it not only be heard, let it be lived.